You woke up one day, and you just didn't recognize yourself. Not dramatically, not like a movie. It was quieter than that, more insidious. You were sitting in a meeting, or driving to pick up your kids, or standing in your own kitchen, and you felt this strange, hollow detachment, like you were watching your own life through scratched glass. Like the woman who used to have opinions, energy, ambition, humor, had been quietly replaced by someone who was just managing, just getting through it. You started snapping at people you love, not because they did anything new, but because something in you had changed and you couldn't name it. You started forgetting things. Not the dramatic forgetting, not names or addresses, the subtle kind. You'd walk into a room and stand there blankly, like the sentence had been deleted mid-thought. You'd lose the word for something you've said 1,000 times. You started waking up at 3 a.m., heart pounding, mind racing, about nothing, about everything, about a conversation from 6 years ago, about whether you locked the car, about your mother, about whether your life is, in some way you can't articulate, fundamentally wrong. You went to your doctor, maybe more than once. You described all of it, the fatigue, the anxiety, the irritability, the fog, the sense of emotional erosion. And they ran your blood work, and they looked at you with that particular brand of medical calm and said, "You're healthy. Everything looks normal. Maybe try to reduce your stress." And you drove home and sat in your car and thought, "I am losing my mind." You are not losing your mind. What is happening to you has a name. It has a biological mechanism. It has a psychological cascade. And the reason nobody told you about it, the reason you're sitting here now, feeling like a ghost in your own life, is one of the most systemic failures in women's healthcare in modern history. This video is not going to tell you to meditate more. It's not going to tell you that self-care is bubble baths and gratitude journals. What it's going to do is explain, in clinical, structural, unflinching detail, exactly what is happening to your brain, your identity, and your nervous system during perimenopause. And it's going to give you language, strategy, and a framework to stop managing your own collapse and start understanding the system that's failing you. Stay with me. Most women have been told, in vague cultural shorthand, that menopause happens around 50 and involves hot flashes and the end of menstruation. That's it. That's the full curriculum most of us received. Here's what nobody told you. Perimenopause, the transition phase before menopause, can begin as early as 35. For most women, it begins quietly, insidiously, somewhere between 38 and 43. And it does not begin with hot flashes. It begins in your brain. Perimenopause is not a single event. It is a 4 to 12-year hormonal reorganization of your entire neurological and endocrine system. During this period, estrogen and progesterone, the two primary female sex hormones, begin fluctuating erratically, not declining steadily the way you might imagine a graceful sunset, fluctuating, spiking, crashing, destabilizing. The hormonal landscape of a perimenopausal brain looks less like a sunset and more like a weather system in collapse. Why does this matter for your brain specifically? Because estrogen is not just a reproductive hormone. It is a neurological hormone. Estrogen receptors exist throughout the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function and decision-making, in the hippocampus, which manages memory, in the amygdala, which regulates emotional response, and in the areas that produce and regulate serotonin, dopamine, and GABA, the neurotransmitters that govern your mood, your motivation, your ability to feel calm, and your sense of self. When estrogen fluctuates wildly, every single one of those systems is destabilized simultaneously. This is not a metaphor. This is neuroscience. And yet, the medical community for decades has addressed perimenopause almost exclusively in reproductive terms. When women report the neurological and psychological symptoms, the fog, the anxiety, the memory disruption, the emotional dysregulation, they are routinely told they are stressed, that they need therapy, that their hormone levels are within normal range, a phrase we will come back to because it is both technically true and functionally meaningless. Let's be precise about what hormonal fluctuation actually does to a living, functioning human brain, because the language we use matters enormously. When we say a woman is hormonal, we invoke decades of cultural dismissal. What we should be saying is that a woman's primary neurological regulatory system is under siege. Here's the architecture of the crisis. Estrogen and serotonin. Estrogen modulates the production and reception of serotonin, the neurotransmitter most associated with mood stability, patience, and emotional resilience. When estrogen drops erratically, serotonin availability drops with it. The result is not simply feeling sad. It is a biochemically induced reduction in your capacity to regulate emotional responses. You are not overreacting. Your brain's regulatory mechanism has been chemically compromised. Estrogen and GABA. GABA is your brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. It is, essentially, your internal brake system. It's what allows you to feel calm in situations that might otherwise provoke anxiety. Estrogen supports GABA receptor sensitivity. When estrogen fluctuates, GABA function becomes erratic. The brake system becomes unreliable. This is why perimenopausal women often describe a new baseline anxiety that feels groundless, because it is groundless. It has no external cause. It is a nervous system that has lost consistent access to its own calming mechanism. Estrogen and dopamine. Dopamine governs motivation, reward, focus, and the sense that effort is worthwhile. Estrogen influences dopamine pathways in the prefrontal cortex. When estrogen destabilizes, the dopamine reward loop weakens. Tasks that used to feel satisfying begin to feel effortful and hollow. Projects you once cared about feel meaningless. The internal engine that drove your ambition, that's a dopamine engine, begins to misfire. And nobody explains this to you, so you interpret it as a character flaw, as laziness, as depression, as failure. Progesterone and sleep. Progesterone has a direct sedative effect on the nervous system. It metabolizes into allopregnanolone, which acts on the same brain receptors as anti-anxiety medications. As progesterone declines in perimenopause, the natural nightly sedation mechanism falters. This is why perimenopausal women frequently experience sleep disruption that is not about stress. It is about the loss of an endogenous neurochemical that was managing their sleep architecture for 20 years. The 3 a.m. awakening is not anxiety. It is pharmaceutical withdrawal from a substance your own body used to produce. Now compound all of this. Simultaneous destabilization of serotonin, GABA, dopamine, and sleep architecture. While you are expected to perform at full capacity as a professional, a parent, a partner, a household manager, a daughter, and a functional adult human being. The wonder is not that you're struggling. The wonder is that you're still standing. Let me ask you something directly. When did you last feel genuinely, uncomplicated patience? Not performed patience. Not the kind where you're smiling while something is dying inside you. Actual, effortless, bottomless tolerance for the ordinary demands of other people? If you're in the 38 to 43 range and you're watching this video, there's a meaningful probability that you're struggling to remember. The irritability of perimenopause is one of its most socially devastating and least discussed symptoms, because it is the one that makes women feel morally deficient rather than biologically compromised. We understand culturally that illness can cause fatigue. We understand that stress can cause headaches. But we have no framework for understanding that neurological disruption can cause what functions, from the outside, as personality change. Here's what's happening mechanically. When the amygdala, your brain's threat detection and emotional response center, loses consistent estrogen support, its calibration shifts. The threshold between neutral stimulus and perceived threat narrows. The sound of your partner chewing, the question your teenager asks for the third time, the particular tone of a coworker's email. These stimuli, which were once processed as minor and ignorable, are now processed by a subtly misfiring amygdala as intrusions, violations, provocations. Your brain is not being dramatic. It is running a threat response protocol on inputs that don't warrant one, because its calibration system has been hormonally disrupted. And here's the particularly cruel dimension of this. Because you are intelligent and self-aware and have been socialized your entire life to monitor and manage your emotional responses, you catch yourself being irritable. You feel shame about it. You apologize. You perform patience that costs you enormous energy. You manage the dissonance between who you believe you are and how you are behaving. That management process, that constant internal policing, is its own form of cognitive drain. You are spending neurological resources on emotional regulation at exactly the moment when your capacity for it has been biologically reduced. There is a term that deserves to become part of every perimenopausal woman's vocabulary: hormonal gaslighting. It is not conspiratorial, it is structural, and it functions like this. You describe a constellation of symptoms: brain fog, sleep disruption, mood dysregulation, fatigue, anxiety, memory lapses, loss of motivation, emotional volatility, that represent a coherent, documented, neurologically explainable syndrome. Your doctor orders a blood test. The blood test measures your FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, and your estradiol levels. Those levels fall within a range that the medical community has defined as normal for your age group. What the test does not capture: the fluctuation pattern of your hormones. The difference between a Monday estrogen level and a Thursday estrogen level. The fact that you may have a normal average level that swings between 40 and 400% of that average within a single cycle. Standard blood work captures a snapshot. Perimenopause is a film, not a photograph. What you are left with is a doctor who has technically correct data and experientially useless conclusions. You are left with, your labs are normal, which your nervous system, your cognitive function, and your emotional experience directly contradict. And then, and this is where the gaslighting operationalizes, you begin to internalize the discrepancy. If the tests say you're fine and you don't feel fine, then the problem must be you, your perception, your resilience, your mental health history, your stress levels, your attitude. This is the moment when women in perimenopause are most frequently funneled toward antidepressants. Not because they are clinically depressed in the traditional diagnostic sense, but because depression is a framework the medical system knows how to address. And perimenopausal neurological disruption is one it doesn't. SSRs can have a place in symptom management, but prescribing them without identifying the hormonal root cause is addressing the smoke alarm while ignoring the fire. And here's the deeper injury: the years, sometimes years, that women spend believing they are psychologically deficient, characterologically broken, constitutionally unable to cope, while what they are actually experiencing is a documented, treatable neurological phenomenon, is a form of harm. The self-doubt that accumulates during that period, the careers altered, the relationships strained, the identity eroded. The medical system's inadequate response to perimenopausal neurological symptoms is not a neutral failure. It has consequences measured in women's lives. Now let's layer a sociological reality on top of the biological one. Because they don't exist in isolation, and understanding the combination is what gives you actual strategic clarity. The women most affected by perimenopausal cognitive symptoms are, disproportionately, women between 38 and 45 who are also carrying what sociologists call invisible labor. The enormous, untracked, uncompensated cognitive and emotional workload of managing a household, a family, a career, and a social network simultaneously. Invisible labor is not a new concept, but let's be specific about its neurological cost. The mental load of running a household, tracking appointments, monitoring refrigerator inventory, anticipating emotional needs, managing social calendars, remembering the permission slip, knowing when the dog was last vaccinated, being the person who knows where everything is. This is not a personality preference. It is a cognitive structure that requires ongoing working memory, executive function, and attentional resources. Research in cognitive psychology refers to this as cognitive load. the amount of active processing your working memory is managing at any given time. Human working memory is finite. When it is chronically near capacity, executive function degrades, decision-making slows, creative thinking narrows, error rates increase, and the ability to regulate emotional responses diminishes. Most women in the 38 to 43 demographic are carrying a chronic invisible labor load that keeps their cognitive systems at near maximum capacity before any hormonal disruption enters the equation. Now introduce perimenopausal neurological compromise, the serotonin reduction, the GABA instability, the sleep disruption, the dopamine misfiring. You are not experiencing brain fog in a vacuum. You are experiencing neurological depletion on top of a cognitive system that was already running at 90% capacity. You are a server that was already taxed beyond optimal load, and someone just tripled the incoming requests. The system crashes. And then someone says, "Why isn't the server working? It was fine last year." Because last year the load was merely unsustainable. This year, it became impossible. I want you to think about your household, your family unit, your partnership, your domestic ecosystem, as a company, not metaphorically, as a structural, functional organization. You are the CEO, not because you chose the role, because in the majority of heterosexual partnerships with children, research consistently demonstrates that women carry the disproportionate share of executive household management, regardless of their professional status, regardless of whether they work full-time, regardless of whether their partner is present and willing. You are the CEO. You carry strategic oversight of every domain: financial planning, child development, relationship maintenance, social connections, health management for multiple people, logistical coordination, emotional culture setting for the entire unit. Now imagine that the CEO of any functional organization began experiencing the following: deteriorating short-term memory, impaired executive function, reduced capacity for emotional regulation, disrupted sleep, diminished motivation, and a pervasive sense of cognitive depletion. What would a functioning board do? They would reduce her operational load while the underlying cause was investigated and addressed. They would bring in support. They would restructure the workload distribution. They would not ask her to perform at the same level with no accommodation and then question her commitment when her performance degraded. What actually happens to women in perimenopause? The load remains the same. The expectations remain the same. The self-expectations, which are often the most brutal, remain the same. And the woman, who has been socialized since childhood to equate productivity with worthiness, interprets her own neurologically induced performance change as a moral failure. This is not a personal psychology problem. This is an organizational structure problem with a gaslit CEO and a board that has never been educated on what perimenopause does to the operational capacity of a functioning executive brain. Let's talk about the brain fog, because it deserves more than a label. It deserves a mechanism. Brain fog is the colloquial term for a cluster of cognitive symptoms: difficulty concentrating, slowed processing speed, impaired retrieval of known information, reduced capacity for complex reasoning, difficulty sustaining attention, and a general sense of mental haziness that does not resolve with rest. In perimenopause, brain fog has several distinct neurological drivers. The first is hippocampal sensitivity to estrogen fluctuation. The hippocampus, your memory consolidation and retrieval center, is richly populated with estrogen receptors. When estrogen drops, hippocampal function is directly impacted. This is why perimenopausal women frequently experience what feels like a dramatic decline in verbal memory, the ability to retrieve specific words, names, and facts on demand. You are not getting stupider. Your memory retrieval system is operating under hormonal interference. The second driver is sleep architecture disruption. We now understand that sleep is not passive recovery. It is an active neurological process during which the glymphatic system clears metabolic waste products from the brain, and during which memory consolidation occurs. When progesterone decline disrupts sleep, particularly the deep, slow wave stages, this clearing and consolidation process is compromised. The result is not just daytime fatigue. It is a brain that is attempting to operate while metabolically congested. The fog is not a metaphor. It is, in a meaningful sense, a physical condition. The third driver is the cortisol cascade. When GABA function is compromised and baseline anxiety increases, cortisol, the primary stress hormone, rises. Chronically elevated cortisol has a well-documented toxic effect on prefrontal cortical function. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for strategic thinking, impulse control, complex decision-making, and working memory. Cortisol, in sustained elevated doses, literally shrinks prefrontal cortical tissue over time. This is not metaphorical drain. This is neurological attrition. Now consider what this means practically. You are a woman who has built a career, possibly a demanding one, on her cognitive capacity. Her ability to strategize, to communicate precisely, to manage complex information, to sustain focus, to perform under pressure. And now, with no warning and no cultural preparation, the neurological architecture that built that career is being disrupted at the same time the cultural narrative tells her she should be in her prime. The productivity collapse is not laziness. It is the predictable outcome of a compromised neurological system attempting to perform at pre-disruption standards with no structural accommodation. Let's address the anxiety specifically, because it deserves its own chapter, and because it is the symptom that, more than any other, sends women into a years-long diagnostic odyssey that usually ends in an antidepressant prescription and no real answers. Perimenopausal anxiety has a different texture than clinical anxiety disorder. Women who have never had an anxiety disorder in their lives begin, at 39 or 41, to experience what they describe as a constant, formless sense of dread, of impending catastrophe with no identifiable source, of being at some fundamental level in danger, without any external evidence of threat. This is GABA withdrawal. This is a nervous system that has lost reliable access to its own calming infrastructure. But there's a second dimension that is equally important: temporal anxiety. Women in the 38 to 43 range are experiencing perimenopause at the precise moment when a series of existential reckonings become unavoidable. Parents are aging or dying. Children are becoming independent, and the identity architecture built around active motherhood begins to shift. Career trajectories that were begun with certain assumptions are revealing themselves to be different from the fantasy. Relationships that were sustained by busyness and routine are, in the new stillness of midlife, revealing their actual quality. The body is changing visibly for the first time in a decade. All of this would be psychologically demanding under any circumstances. Under perimenopausal neurological conditions, with diminished serotonin, compromised GABA, and a hyperreactive amygdala, the processing of these reckonings becomes acute, destabilizing, and overwhelming. The anxiety is not irrational. It is, in many ways, accurate. But it is being processed through a neurological system that cannot modulate it, cannot contextualize it, cannot find perspective on it. Because the very systems that provide perspective and modulation have been hormonally compromised. This is why perimenopausal anxiety so often has an apocalyptic quality. It is not that the concerns are irrational. It is that they are being experienced with no neurochemical buffer. Here is a dynamic that almost nobody talks about, and that may be the most privately destabilizing aspect of perimenopausal psychological experience: the oscillation between emotional numbness and disproportionate rage. On the numbness side, women describe looking at their children and feeling an alarming absence of the warmth they know they're supposed to feel. Sitting at dinner with their families and feeling profoundly, inexplicably alone. Receiving good news, a promotion, a friend's engagement, a child's achievement, and feeling nothing. A flat, gray, interior landscape where feeling used to live. This is not a sign that you have stopped loving the people in your life. This is anhedonia, the clinical term for the reduced capacity to experience pleasure or emotional resonance, driven by dopamine dysfunction and serotonin depletion. It is as neurological as a broken arm is orthopedic. On the rage side, the same women who feel emotionally numb in one context experience disproportionate, startling anger in another. The specific infuriating quality of perimenopausal rage, as opposed to ordinary anger, is its target. It is rarely directed at genuine injustice or genuine provocation. It erupts over the loaded dishwasher that was not started, the repeated question, the casual dismissal, the small, accumulated evidences of invisibility. Here is the psychological mechanism. Women who are experiencing emotional numbness, who are cut off from the full range of their emotional experience, are also cut off from the internal signals that typically allow them to identify and articulate needs before they become crises. The numbness suppresses the signal builds, and what emerges on the other side is not the original nuanced need, it is its overflow. The rage is not about the dishwasher. The rage is about the 10,000 moments of invisibility that the neurochemical buffer used to help you process that now have nowhere to go. You are not becoming a different person. You are becoming a person whose emotional processing system is operating without its usual infrastructure. I need you to sit with a question that most people are too uncomfortable to ask directly. Who were you before you became who everyone needed you to be? Not philosophically, practically. Before the career identity, before the mother identity, before the wife or partner identity, before the dependable one and the capable one and the one who handles it, before the identity that was constructed brick by brick from other people's needs and expectations and your remarkable capacity to meet them. Who were you? Most women in the 38 to 43 range cannot answer that question quickly. And the reason perimenopause accelerates this particular crisis is structural. When the neurological systems that sustain high-performance functioning begin to falter, the identities that were built on that functioning begin to feel fragile. If your sense of self has been substantially built on your productivity, your competence, your emotional availability, your capacity to manage everything, and all of those capacities are being neurologically undermined, then the hormonal disruption is not just affecting your brain. It is affecting your self-concept, your sense of who you are, your sense of what you're worth. Psychologists call this identity foreclosure. When a person's sense of self has been so thoroughly constructed around a particular role or function that any disruption to that role or function triggers existential crisis. Women are particularly vulnerable to this because, for most of us, the roles we built our identities around were not freely chosen. They were socially prescribed. We were rewarded for competence, availability, productivity, emotional labor. We built our self-concepts around the things we were applauded for performing. And now, at 40, the applause is the same, but our capacity to perform the show is intermittently failing. This is not midlife crisis in the cliched sense. This is the forced renegotiation of an identity that was, in retrospect, never fully yours. There is a psychological pattern so common among women in this demographic that it functions almost as a cultural inheritance, what we might call the martyrdom complex. The deeply ingrained belief that your own needs, signals, limits, and pain are less important than the needs of the people around you, and that attending to your own suffering is a form of selfishness or weakness. This is not a personal failing. It is a learned behavior, systematically reinforced across a lifetime. From childhood, most women are socialized with a specific attentional orientation, outward. Notice other people's feelings, anticipate other people's needs, manage other people's discomfort, monitor the emotional temperature of the room and adjust accordingly. Be thoughtful, be considerate, be accommodating. What this produces, over 30-odd years, is a woman who has become extraordinarily sophisticated at reading external signals and profoundly untrained at reading internal ones. A woman who can detect her partner's low-grade irritation from across a room, but who has spent decades overriding her own fatigue, hunger, grief, anger, and need as inconvenient. Perimenopause sends loud internal signals. The fatigue is real. The pain is real. The cognitive disruption is real. The emotional dysregulation is real. But the martyrdom complex, the internalized training, processes those signals through a filter of dismissal. I shouldn't be this tired. I don't have time to feel this way. Other people have it harder. I just need to push through. This is the filter that causes women to spend 2, 3, 4 years in perimenopausal neurological disruption without seeking appropriate help. Because seeking help requires acknowledging, first to yourself and then to others, that you are struggling. And struggling has been implicitly coded as failure. The most tactical thing you can do at this moment in your life is develop what I would call biological self-literacy. The practice of treating your body's signals with the same analytical seriousness you would apply to any complex system under your professional management. If a system in your organization was generating the warning signals your nervous system is generating, you would not tell it to push through. You would investigate. You would call in expertise. You would restructure the load. Apply that same logic to yourself. There is one more symptom that deserves direct, unapologetic attention, because it is one that generates enormous shame and bewilderment in the women experiencing it, and almost no clinical acknowledgement. Sensory overload. Women in perimenopause frequently develop a dramatically lowered threshold for environmental stimulation. The television and the overhead light and someone talking to them simultaneously, which used to be navigable background noise, becomes acutely intolerable. The sound of eating, the texture of certain fabrics, the persistent presence of other people's needs, the phone notifications, the noise of a shared space. What's happening neurologically? The same amygdala dysregulation that narrows the thresholds between neutral stimulus and perceived threat also narrows the threshold between ordinary environmental input and sensory overwhelm. A nervous system running on compromised GABA, without its reliable inhibitory infrastructure, has diminished capacity to filter and background process environmental stimuli. What used to be filtered now intrudes. What used to be ignorable now registers as assault. This is why many perimenopausal women describe a profound and distressing need to simply be alone. Not because they've become misanthropic, not because they don't love their families, but because shared space, with its constant ambient demands and stimuli, has become neurologically costly in a way it never was before. And here's the cruelty of this particular symptom. The women who experience it most acutely are often those with the least structural access to solitude. Women with children, women in open-plan offices, women in households where other people's needs and presences are constant. The overstimulation creates withdrawal. The withdrawal creates guilt. The guilt creates more cortisol. The cortisol further compromises prefrontal function. The loop closes. The system degrades further. The need for solitude, silence, and reduced stimulation in perimenopause is not a personality regression. It is a neurological prescription. Your nervous system is telling you what it needs to function. The question is whether you have, or can create, the structural conditions to give it that. Now we get tactical, not vague, specific. Here are concrete moves you can make immediately. 1. Find a specialist, not a generalist. Your primary care physician is not the right person for this conversation. Not because they are bad doctors, but because perimenopausal neurological symptom management is a specialty area that most general practitioners receive minimal training in. Seek out a gynecologist, endocrinologist, or functional medicine physician who explicitly focuses on perimenopause and menopause. Organizations like the Menopause Society, formerly NAMS, the North American Menopause Society, maintain practitioner directories of certified menopause specialists. This is your first organizational move. 2. Track your symptoms as data, not complaints. Before your appointment, build a symptom log. Not narrative, not emotional. Analytical. Date, symptom, severity, 1 to 10, time of day, relationship to your cycle, sleep quality the night before. 2 to 4 weeks of this data gives a specialist a pattern, not a snapshot. It is the difference between a blood test and a film. This data positions you not as a patient reporting distress, but as a person presenting evidence. Doctors respond differently to evidence. Use that. 3. Learn the language. When you walk into a medical appointment, these are the specific things you say. I would like to discuss perimenopausal symptom management, specifically the neurological and psychological symptoms, not just the reproductive ones. I understand my labs may be within normal range, but I'd like to discuss whether the fluctuation pattern of my hormones might be clinically relevant. I'd like to explore whether my symptoms are consistent with estrogen and progesterone instability, and what evidence-based treatment options exist, including hormone therapy. You are not asking, you are directing the clinical conversation. This is a cognitive reframe that matters. You are the CEO of your own healthcare. The doctor is a specialist consultant. Consult them with specificity. 4. Restructure your cognitive load, deliberately and without apology. Identify the top 5 ongoing cognitive tasks in your invisible labor portfolio that can be delegated, automated, or eliminated. Not reduced, transferred. The cognitive load research is clear. Partial delegation does not reduce mental load if you retain the managerial oversight. The goal is full transfer of ownership, meaning another person, partner, older child, professional service, owns the task, tracks the task, and manages the task without you as the backstop. This is not giving up. This is emergency resource reallocation during a period of neurological compromise. A CEO whose company is in crisis does not personally manage every operational detail. She triages ruthlessly and delegates strategically. 5. Create non-negotiable recovery architecture. Identify 2 to 3 daily conditions that directly serve your neurological recovery. These are not luxuries. They are operational requirements. For most perimenopausal women, evidence supports 7 to 9 hours of sleep opportunity, not just time in bed. 30 minutes of moderate aerobic exercise, which has demonstrated impact on hippocampal volume, serotonin production, and GABA function. And a minimum daily period of sensory-reduced, obligation-free time. Even 20 minutes of genuine quiet, not productivity, not phone, functions as a nervous system reset. Build these into your schedule with the same structural protection you apply to important meetings. When they are proposed to be removed or interrupted, you decline. Not with apology. With the same matter-of-fact firmness you would apply to any non-negotiable professional commitment. 6. Develop specific language for your relationships. The people around you, particularly partners and older children, are likely confused by the changes they're observing. They may be interpreting your irritability as anger at them, your withdrawal as rejection, your cognitive lapses as inattentiveness. In the absence of information, people write their own narrative, and that narrative is almost always personal. Give them a different narrative, not as a therapy exercise, but as a strategic communication move. You can say, "What I'm going through right now is a neurological transition, similar to what puberty did to me at 13, but in reverse. My brain chemistry is genuinely, measurably different than it was 2 years ago. I need you to understand that when I'm irritable or withdrawn or struggling to focus, it is not about you, and it is not permanent. And I need structural support, not emotional management." This is not vulnerability. This is information transfer. It moves the conversation from interpersonal conflict to collaborative problem solving. It puts both parties on the same side of an actual problem, rather than opposite sides of a perceived one. I want to offer you a reframe that is not optimistic spin, because I don't deal in optimistic spin, but is, I believe, analytically accurate. Perimenopause, as a neurological event, is forcing a renegotiation that most women in this culture never otherwise get permission to make. It is forcing you to confront the unsustainability of the invisible labor model you've been operating under. Not because you chose to confront it, but because your nervous system has declared bankruptcy and refused to continue subsidizing the enterprise. It is forcing you to examine the identities you've built around productivity, availability, and emotional labor, and to ask, perhaps for the first time with genuine urgency, which parts of those identities you actually chose, and which parts were assigned to you and accepted for lack of an alternative. It is forcing you to take your own signals seriously, because the signals have become too loud to override. None of this is comfortable. The discomfort is real, and it is not a phase you simply wait through. But there is a difference between discomfort as pure suffering and discomfort as information. What perimenopause is communicating at enormous volume is that the system you were operating, the self as an infinite resource, the woman as the structural support for everyone else's functioning, was never sustainable. You just didn't have the evidence to stop it until now. The neurological disruption is not the problem. The neurological disruption is the alarm. The problem is the architecture that made the alarm inevitable. Women who come through perimenopause with their identities, relationships, and cognitive capacity intact are not women who endured it passively. They are women who used it as a crisis that forced structural renegotiation. Who came out the other side with different boundaries, different self-definitions, different distributions of labor and responsibility and care? Who stopped performing a version of themselves that was, in retrospect, costing them more than they were ever told it would? You are not declining. You are being forced, biochemically, neurologically, somewhat brutally, to stop running a system that was failing you, that you were too strong and too conditioned to stop running voluntarily. I want to leave you with one thing. Not a to-do list, not a mantra, not an affirmation. A question. And an invitation. The question: what have you been tolerating about your own life because your capacity to endure was too high to force the reckoning? Not what is hard, what you have been tolerating, accepting as unchangeable, managing as permanent, because your resilience, your competence, your trained-in martyrdom made it manageable. Until now. The invitation is this. Instead of treating the capacity decline of perimenopause as the crisis, treat it as the audit. Let your compromised tolerance for overload reveal what was always too much. Let the rage at the dishwasher be the signal that you have been carrying something far heavier than a dishwasher for far longer than was ever reasonable to ask of one person. Let the emotional numbness be the map of where you went away, and begin to trace the route back. You are not broken. You are not declining. You are not a woman who has run out of capacity. You are a woman whose neurological system has, somewhat brutally, stopped protecting the status quo. What you do with that information is the most important decision of the next decade of your life. And you are, despite everything, because of everything, the most qualified person to make it.